Now, still speaking of politics, but back in the Southern Hemisphere, and Christopher Luxon will be the new Prime Minister of New Zealand after the Nationals beat the Labor Party. He's previously gone on the record saying he's open to the idea of ditching King Charles as the head of state, and he said, I quote, ultimately the country would become a republic. We've seen this throughout the world, Esther. I suppose King Charles is pretty used to it by now. Where do you see the Commonwealth progressing?
Well, look, this was always the fear when his mother passed, that more countries would break away from the Commonwealth and from the empire more broadly. And so the monarchy has always been aware of that possibility. It's ironic that this is coming from, a conservative politician in New Zealand, but obviously the Overton window shifts depending on which country you're talking about and which conservatives traditionally hold certain views. Now, the fact that he has been been a bit firmer than Jacinda Ardern in saying actually he does believe that at some point New Zealand will become a republic is quite telling. It's almost like he has a crystal ball and he can see into the future, and he's making no qualms that will likely be the outcome. I'm a bit more skeptical. I say that people value tradition a lot more in their old age, and if we're going off of what young people think of the royal family and the monarchy and how it will survive into the future, I don't think that's very accurate. The older you get, the more you think about legacy and what to leave your family. And I'm sure at the time that they will probably have a vote in the future, that will probably resonate a lot more as well. We've had the same conversations about Australia, even though the monarchy does enjoy significant support in Australia and New Zealand outside of the United Kingdom. This is something that King Charles has always been used to, and it is a balancing act that they have to ultimately deal with. So I don't think this is anything new. I doubt that his predictions will actually manifest, at least in my lifetime. But it's something that is always on the radar of the royal family, and it's something that we have to bear in mind.
Now, still on the Commonwealth, Charles is off to Kenya later this month. He has plans to honour the Queen during this visit. What does he have in mind?
So he's going to be the first monarch to address the Mau Mau uprisings and the role of the British Army in actually suppressing them. Obviously, the British government did acknowledge them back in 2013 when they paid roughly a sum of £20 million to about 5,000 survivors of those uprisings, and how they were brutally stamped down by members of the British Empire. But at the end of the day, it's important for him to acknowledge it. Many people don't actually know about the Mau Mau uprisings, even though they involved, I believe it's the largest tribe in Kenya, the Kikuyus, and it's still a sore point for many Kenyans. Now, I don't believe in going around the world to apologize for sins of the past, because at the end of the day, that's impossible. And I think it's also a bit tone deaf. Many of us that exist today are beneficiaries of our ancestors committing some sort of vile or barbaric atrocity to further their civilizations. When our ancestors pillaged villages and effectively brought down civilizations to further their own, we now in modern day are effective beneficiaries of that, including many Africans as well who were involved in atrocities like the slave trade. Ethiopia was one of the last countries in Africa to actually abolish slavery under pressure from the British in the 1940s and 50s, and we can't actually believe that now. But it still happened, and it's actually to this day slavery is still a problem in those parts of the world. But I do think it's important for the king to acknowledge what happened and highlight the progress that the relationship between the Britain and Kenya has made, and hopes for the future. And I think that's the important tone to strike. Look, I'm not under any impression that it's easy being the king and trying to strike the right tone when it comes to these sorts of issues that have to be addressed. But I think that is the way forward. It's not about apologizing, because no one who committed those atrocities is alive today. But it's about acknowledging, and it's about moving forward and highlighting a new and better relationship. And I think that's what the king is going to do. And I think that's what makes the royal family so valuable.
Now, staying with Charles, and it's been reported that hundreds of iconic brands face not gaining the King's seal of approval unless they prove their green credentials. The existing and sought-after royal warrants have become void, obviously, when the Queen passed away, and those firms now need to reapply for them. We know that Charles is a conservationist. Does this surprise you?
Absolutely not. I mean, if you know anything about King Charles, this has been probably one of his more consistent and entrenched positions. He's been talking about the environment and protecting it since the 1970s. So this is not something that surprises people. But the pressure that it will have on, household brands that do have the royal warrant will be immense. We may very well see brands that we are very familiar and fond of actually disappearing. So, for example, Cadbury may actually not get its royal seal of approval because it doesn't use fair trade cocoa, which is important to the king, obviously, particularly giving the farmers that farm cocoa better working conditions and better pay, better negotiation. We know that Audi, which is owned by VW, they had a scandal a few years ago where they effectively doctored their emissions figures. We could see them come under fire for not meeting the standards of King Charles and who he's willing to award a royal warrant to. We see the likes of Burberry, who a few years ago burnt a lot of their unsold stock. That's again very unenvironmentally friendly. So we're going to actually see a lot of these brands face a lot of pressure. Now we know there's a lot of value in having the royal warrant. The estimates that it gives companies a 5% boost in revenue over their competitors. Now, if you contextualize it, a lot of these companies are pulling in revenue in the hundreds of millions of pounds. 5% of that is quite significant. So they will be battling it out. But there's also the flip side of are these standards going to put unnecessary pressure on companies that may not be able to adapt as quickly as King Charles wants? You don't want to involve the royal family in too much politics. And by actually telling businesses how they can run their affairs, you could get into murky waters. So obviously there has to be, I suspect, the onus or the kind of threshold to actually demonstrate that you're being environmentally friendly will not be very high, and I think it will be subject to independent counsel, so it doesn't look like that the king is ordering businesses around. But so far as they demonstrate that isn't their vision, even if they highlight sort of investments that they're willing to make into more environmentally friendly practices, I think that will probably pass the threshold. But it does have impact, and it does definitely stay in the vein of King Charles and his passion for the environment.
Yeah, now one quick last one for our history buffs. Now, Henry V is probably the most popular king there is. He beat the French at Agincourt. It might not seem particularly relevant to Australia, but it's part of our history too. It is actually very relevant. What would have the world looked like if he'd lost? Esther, would we be speaking French?
We probably would have, actually. So there is this weird romanticization of past monarchs. Understandably so, they're still a very significant part of British culture. But actually, you can make that argument with a lot of people. You can make that argument with Queen Elizabeth's father during the time of the Second World War. We will probably likely be speaking German, and I'm not sure what would happen in Australia. You might still be speaking English, but it would have been a very different ball game. So I do find it interesting when we romanticize certain monarchs. There have been a string of monarchs that have not been particularly, or should I say, beneficial to the United Kingdom or our history. One of the most famous ones that come to mind is Henry VIII and his poor wives, and his abrogation from the Catholic Church, which now means we have the Church of England and all of that. So it's interesting when these figures are almost deified, when actually, if one action went wrong, the course of history would have changed significantly. I may not be here. I may not be speaking English. I may not have come from Ghana. So it's important to bear that in mind.
As always, Esther, lovely to chat with you, and we will speak to you again soon.